winter arrived early in the Ardennes. By December 1944, the forests of Belgium were buried beneath thick snow, their narrow roads frozen hard and slick with ice. The air itself felt heavy, thick with silence, the kind that only exists before something terrible begins. For the exhausted American troops scattered across the Ardennes, winter meant cold, hunger, and the quiet belief that the war was nearly over. They were wrong. In the early hours of December 16th, the silence shattered. The German army, battered but not broken, unleashed its final gamble, a massive counteroffensive aimed straight through the Ardennes. The plan was desperate, ambitious, and brutal. Punch through the thinly held American lines, seize the vital crossroads town of Bastogne, split the Allied forces in two, and force a negotiated peace. For the men on the ground, it felt like the world had collapsed overnight. The American units guarding the region were stretched thin. Many were inexperienced, some barely trained. The cold was merciless, cutting through boots and coats alike. Ammunition was scarce, food even more so. And yet, as German armor surged forward through the fog and snow, these soldiers found themselves standing in the path of one of the last great offensives of the war. At the center of it all sat the town of Bastogne. 7 major roads converged there. Whoever controlled it controlled movement across the region. The German command knew this. The American command knew it too. And so, as the German attack unfolded, Bastogne became the hinge upon which the entire battle would turn. By December 18th, American units had been pushed back from all sides. Communication lines were severed. Supply routes vanished. Snowstorms grounded Allied aircraft. And slowly, inevitably, the noose tightened. The 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of other units, found themselves completely surrounded, cut off, outnumbered, freezing. To the German High Command, the situation appeared almost comical in its simplicity. Here was an elite American division, trapped in a forest, without proper winter clothing, low on ammunition, and isolated from reinforcements. The Germans believed the outcome was obvious, so they sent an ultimatum. On the morning of December 22, 1944, a small German delegation approached American lines under a white flag. Their message was delivered formally, politely, and with confidence. The terms were clear: surrender, or face complete destruction. The German commander expected hesitation, fear, negotiation. Instead, the message was carried to the acting American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. McAuliffe had been asleep when the demand arrived. He read the message, blinked once, and reportedly muttered a single word: "Nuts." At first, his staff thought he was joking. Then they realized that was his answer. The reply sent back to the Germans consisted of just one word: no threats, no speeches, no conditions, just nuts. It was a response so unexpected, so dismissive, that the German officers reportedly had to ask for clarification. When the meaning was explained, their confusion turned to disbelief. The Americans were surrounded, outgunned, outnumbered, and they were refusing to surrender. To the German command, it seemed absurd. The logic was clear: surrounded forces surrender. That is how wars work. But logic does not always govern morale. Inside Bastogne, the mood shifted. The cold remained. The hunger remained. The shelling intensified. But something else appeared: resolve. The knowledge that retreat was no longer an option created a strange clarity. The soldiers dug deeper into frozen ground. They shared ammunition. They shared cigarettes. They shared rumors of reinforcements that might or might not come. And above them, the sky began to clear. For days, bad weather had grounded Allied aircraft. That weather had protected the German advance. But now the clouds began to break. And with that break came the sound every soldier in Bastogne had been waiting for. Engines. High above, American aircraft appeared. First a few, then dozens, then hundreds. Supplies dropped from the sky, medical kits, ammunition, food, hope. The German encirclement was no longer airtight, and somewhere miles away, a man named George S. Patton was moving his Third Army north at an impossible speed, performing one of the most audacious maneuvers of the war. But that was still to come. For now, in the frozen forests around Bastogne, American soldiers held their lines, refusing to yield. The German command had expected fear. What they found instead was defiance. The siege of Bastogne had begun, and the outcome would change the course of the war. By the time the German ultimatum reached American lines, the winter had tightened its grip on Bastogne. Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, muffling sound and swallowing color. Trees stood frozen like black skeletons. Foxholes filled with ice. Rifles jammed. Men wrapped rags around their boots because proper winter gear had never arrived. The cold was not just uncomfortable, it was a weapon, gnawing at bone, draining strength, dulling thought. Inside the encircled town, the situation was desperate. Ammunition was rationed. Medical supplies were nearly gone. Wounded men lay on frozen floors, their breath rising in white clouds. Medics worked with numb fingers, cutting uniforms away with knives that barely sliced. Every explosion shook the ground, every shell a reminder that the ring around Bastogne was tightening. Yet morale did not break. It hardened. When the German ultimatum demanding surrender arrived, it was delivered with the certainty of victory. The German commander expected fear, perhaps negotiation. What he received instead was confusion, then disbelief. Nuts! The word spread through the American lines like fire. It was absurd. It was defiant. It was exactly what the men needed to hear. In one word, the psychological balance shifted. The Germans had expected fear. They found stubbornness. That single reply traveled fast, carried from foxhole to foxhole, warming men more effectively than any fire. It became a statement of identity. They were surrounded, yes, but not beaten. Still, bravado could not stop artillery. Shells continued to fall day and night. Trees exploded into splinters. Buildings collapsed into themselves. Medics worked without rest. The wounded cried out for morphine that no longer existed. Frostbite claimed as many men as bullets. Every hour tested endurance. And yet, help was coming. Far to the south, Lieutenant General George S. Patton had already begun moving. When news of the German breakthrough reached his headquarters, Patton did not ask if he could respond. He asked when. In a moment that would become legend, he turned to his staff and declared that his Third Army would pivot north, in the dead of winter, and strike the Germans from the flank. It was a maneuver few believed possible. Roads were iced over. Bridges were blown. Supply lines were stretched thin. Entire divisions would have to turn on a dime, reverse direction, and advance through hostile terrain faster than any army had a right to. But Patton believed speed itself was a weapon. Orders were issued. Engines roared to life. Columns of tanks and trucks began to roll northward, day and night. Headlights dimmed, drivers guided by frozen ruts and instinct. Men slept in vehicles, ate cold rations, and drove through snowstorms that erased the road ahead. Every mile mattered. Every hour counted. Meanwhile, inside Bastogne, the siege tightened. German artillery pounded the perimeter relentlessly. The wounded overflowed aid stations. Food was rationed to the bare minimum. Some soldiers went days without a warm meal. Still, the line held. What sustained them was not comfort, but belief. They believed relief was coming. They believed someone, somewhere, was fighting their way toward them. And they were right. On December 26, 1944, after days of brutal fighting through snow-covered forests and shattered villages, the lead elements of Patton's Third Army broke through the German lines near Bastogne. Tanks rolled forward, their engines roaring like thunder. Infantry followed close behind, weapons ready. When the first American vehicles reached the outskirts of the town, weary defenders emerged from their foxholes and ruins. Some laughed, some cried, some simply stood in silence, too exhausted to react. The siege was broken. The cost had been terrible. Thousands were dead or wounded. The town was in ruins. But the German gamble had failed. Bastogne had held. And in doing so, it had broken the momentum of the last great German offensive in the West. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for weeks, but the outcome was now inevitable. The German army had spent its final reserves. Its last gamble had failed. From that moment forward, the war's direction was no longer in doubt. What had begun as a desperate gamble in the snow ended as a turning point in history. Not because of overwhelming numbers alone, but because of resilience, stubbornness, and the refusal to yield when surrender seemed logical. The men at Bastogne did not just defend a town. They shattered the illusion that the German army could still dictate the course of the war, and in doing so, they helped bring the end of the conflict one step closer. When the guns around Bastogne finally fell silent, what remained was not victory in the way men imagine it in speeches or textbooks. What remained was exhaustion. Snow-covered fields were littered with the burned skeletons of vehicles. Trees stood splintered like broken bones. The air smelled of oil, cordite, and death long after the firing stopped. The landscape itself seemed stunned, as if it needed time to understand what had just passed through it. For the soldiers who survived, the end of the battle did not feel like triumph. It felt like survival had been granted on credit, a debt that would one day be collected. The German forces withdrew eastward in fragments. Units that had once marched with precision now moved in silence, fragmented, leaderless. Officers no longer spoke of victory. They spoke of survival, of escape, of making it home alive. The dream of reversing the war had dissolved into the cold mud of the Ardennes. For those who remained behind, the realization was inescapable. The war had turned irrevocably against them. The men of the Wehrmacht had fought with discipline and resolve, but they had collided with something no amount of courage could defeat: industrial scale. The Allies were not just an army. They were a machine. Every loss was replaced, every setback absorbed, every mistake corrected with overwhelming force. The German war machine, once feared for its speed and precision, now found itself exhausted, undersupplied, and outproduced. Fuel was scarce, ammunition rationed, air cover nearly non-existent. The skies belonged to the enemy, and with air superiority came inevitability. Day after day, Allied bombers carved deep into German territory, destroying rail lines, factories, and communications. Every road became a trap. every movement was seen. The concept of maneuver warfare, once the pride of German doctrine, became meaningless when movement itself invited annihilation. For the soldiers who had survived Bastogne, this realization came slowly and painfully. Some still believed in victory, clinging to faith or propaganda. Others saw the truth and said nothing, knowing that hope itself had become dangerous. Many began to fight only for the man beside them. That, more than ideology, became the final motivation: survival, loyalty, and the desire to see another sunrise. The war dragged on, but its outcome was already sealed. By early 1945, Allied armies were pushing deep into Germany. Cities fell one by one. Refugees clogged the roads. The sound of artillery became constant. What had begun as a war of movement ended as a slow, grinding collapse. And then, at last, it was over. Germany surrendered, not in a dramatic moment, but in exhaustion. The silence that followed was almost unreal. For soldiers who had lived for years under the thunder of artillery, the quiet felt unnatural, even frightening. For those who had fought at Bastogne, the memory never faded. They remembered the cold, the fear, the moment when they believed the world might end. But they also remembered something else: the moment they realized that history does not turn on grand speeches or heroic myths, but on endurance, on the ability to stand when everything says you should fall, on the refusal to surrender, even when surrounded, and on the understanding that wars are not won in moments of glory, but in long, grinding tests of will. The Battle of the Bulge did not end the war, but it ended the illusion that Germany could win it. The steel horizon that once promised dominance became the boundary of defeat. And in its shadow, the world stepped into a new age, shaped by the lessons of a war that had finally consumed itself. When the war finally ended, the war did not end with a single explosion or a triumphant parade. It ended slowly, in fragments, in exhaustion, in silence. By the spring of 1945, the world that had once burned across Europe had begun to collapse inward. The front lines no longer moved with strategy or ambition. They crumbled. German units retreated not because they were ordered to, but because there was nowhere left to stand. Roads were choked with refugees, wounded soldiers, shattered vehicles, and the remnants of an empire that had exhausted every resource it possessed. For those who had survived the Ardennes, the final months of the war felt unreal. The terror of constant battle gave way to something quieter but heavier: the realization that everything they had endured had led not to victory, but to ruin. In the East, entire cities lay in ruins. In the West, Allied forces advanced with a confidence born not of arrogance, but of inevitability. The rhythm of war had changed. Where once the Germans had dictated the tempo, now they were simply reacting, always a step behind. For the men who had stood on the Normandy coast and stared into the endless Armada, the meaning of that moment became painfully clear. That morning had not been the beginning of a battle. It had been the beginning of the end. The scale of the Allied war machine was unlike anything history had ever seen. Factories across the United States worked around the clock, producing ships, aircraft, tanks, and ammunition at a rate that defied comprehension. Entire cities existed solely to feed the machinery of war. By the time the Allies pushed deep into Germany, they were no longer fighting an army alone. They were confronting an industrial system designed for total victory. Against that, courage and discipline were no longer enough. German soldiers continued to fight with determination, but each engagement revealed the same imbalance. Where one tank was lost, 3 more replaced it. Where a bridge was destroyed, another appeared. Where a regiment collapsed, another took its place. The war had become arithmetic, and the numbers no longer favored Germany. By early 1945, the illusion of control was gone. High command spoke of sacrifice, but the frontline soldiers understood the truth. The war was not ending because of defeat in a single battle. It was ending because the world had outgrown them. In the ruins of cities like Cologne, Aachen, and Berlin, the final chapter unfolded. Buildings that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. Civilians wandered through streets unrecognizable from memory. The sound of artillery became a constant echo, no longer shocking, just expected. When the final surrender came, it arrived not with triumph, but with exhaustion. There were no cheers, only relief. For the soldiers who survived, victory brought little comfort. Many returned home to cities they no longer recognized, families they barely knew, and memories that refused to fade. The war had taken more than lives. It had taken youth, certainty, and innocence. For the world, the war left a lesson written in ruin. It proved that industrial power could reshape the fate of nations. That ideology, when combined with machinery and mass mobilization, could consume entire continents. And that once unleashed, such forces are nearly impossible to contain. The steel horizon that had once signaled domination became a warning, a reminder of what happens when ambition outpaces wisdom. History would remember the battles, the leaders, the dates. But for those who lived it, the truth was simpler. The war did not end because someone won. It ended because there was nothing left to destroy. And in that silence, humanity was forced to confront what it had become, and what it must never become again.